everyone, and welcome back to the Social Work Bubble podcast. I'm your host, Laura, and I practice as a therapist in New York City. Today, we have a special guest, Luccas Contreras. He is an MSW student, and he currently works as a social worker in a crisis stabilization center in Wisconsin, and also a part-time domestic violence case manager. So he's a very busy person. Glad that he was able to come on the podcast today. We're going to talk all about toxic masculinity, eating disorders in men, and everything in between. So we'll dive in. Luccas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Do you want to share a little bit about your journey to social work?
Yeah, thanks. It's been crazy to get here with my busy life, but I'm glad to be on, and thanks for having me on. Oh man, how did I get to social work? I guess to start recently, pre-pandemic, I had been pursuing a different career. I left mental health and I was pursuing firefighting of all things for about 3 years, and then the pandemic hit. And I was like, well, I left mental health for a reason, got burnt out at the age of 26, the ripe age of 26. And I started when I was 19, and my original background in undergrad was in art therapy. So I did my undergrad work in Boston, and then I had moved to Wisconsin originally for a graduate program in art therapy. Towards the end of my undergrad work, I, was questioning like if I wanted to go to a more clinical route. And so I got to grad school, deferred for a semester, deferred for a year, ended up working at a hospital out here in Wisconsin, at a anxiety disorder and OCD disorder residential facility. So did that for quite a while and moved back to Boston to work at McLean Hospital to also do OCD work. Life happens, children happen, fast forward. I got burnt out with life things, loss of a family member, specifically my dad, and, just kind of a disarray of things. And I was like, I need to sort some stuff out, took a break, did the firefighting thing. And then when COVID hit and I was wanting to pursue mental health again, I felt a real calling back to the field. And this will tie into our topic today. So while in the fire department, working with law enforcement, emergency services, I saw a lot of not great things, very traumatic things, which, I only did it for 3 years, so I can only imagine what these people in this profession see in a long-term basis. And it's really not talked about. And so when I was doing some more research, I found in the past 10 years, there's been more suicides across the board with law enforcement, firefighters, and emergency responders, including paramedics, more so than line of duty deaths, which we tend to hear more about. And so after fire department thing didn't work out, I was like, well, I'm still very interested in this field and helping these male-dominated fields, because not only if you look at the suicide rates, there's also high rates of domestic violence, substance use, anxiety, depression that's not talked about, PTSD, et cetera, and the list goes on. And I didn't find it a coincidence that these are male-dominated professions. Would I say it's gotten better? Yeah, and that's mainly because incidents have happened within fire departments or law enforcement departments where a person has committed or not committed, had a successful suicide within these departments, and then it gets attention and they're like, oh, we need to deal with something now, rather than having preventative care. so when I was looking to go back to school, I was like, clinical counseling, social work. And I'm like, I always figured, like, to be honest, I had no desire to be a social worker. I always thought like social workers were like mean and clinical counselors, we were just on another level. And I just didn't like, I think that's probably because my own, my own internal trauma of working with a social worker in the past or something.
Yeah.
But so fast forward, I was like, I have a good background in working with various populations since the age of 19 when I got in the field, doing more clinical counseling work, more micro level work. And I really loved that, really enjoyed it. But as a person of color, as well as a man and a person who has struggled with their own mental health, I wanted to look at things at a more systemic level, which led me to social work to get some more macro, meso level work.
So it got you eventually.
It got me eventually, and I haven't turned back, and love it.
I love how, I mean, everyone really has their individual journey to social work. Sometimes it's just, as life goes on, we have these different experiences that just pull us back to the field, or maybe we start that way, change our mind and come back to it. So that's exciting to hear your journey.
Yeah, it's an unconventional one.
So you kind of mentioned a little bit already about toxic masculinity, especially with what you saw in your experiences. To start off, how would you define toxic masculinity?
Sure, yeah. And to start off with, I still am not sure how I feel about the term toxic masculinity. I use it, but then I think it depends in what setting I'm using it in. And that's been a struggle lately because in the academia world, I tend to use that term more freely. But when I'm talking to a man or a man's man who has no concept of what that is, has no concept of what social work, mental health is, then I may, change my wording a little bit. But essentially, what I find toxic masculinity to be is really about control and dominance as a man, to devaluate women, have homophobia, and kind of feed and prey off violence. Those are some heavy hitters to start with, but to give examples, it's the constraints we put on young boys and men to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, tough it out, rub some dirt in it, be man enough to overcome these things, that we always have to be that symbol of strength. And in turn, when we do these things, and set the precedents for our young men or young boys, then it can turn into toxic masculinity because that's what's instilled in our society.
That's very true. You had mentioned, like some examples of what that can look like. So what do you think in terms of like the meso and macro level, how this kind of masculinity takes shape?
Sure. On the macro level, you can see it within white systemic racism for sure, in just how our country is run generally by white men. And for instance, we can talk about reproductive rights in a state by state manner, where a lot of these decisions are being made by white men to oppress women in their body choice. So I would say on a macro level, we have these heads of state, whether in political office, business, CEOs, of male dominance, that can be seen at the macro level who are writing these policies. And then on a meso level, you see it in schools, neighborhoods, for instance, in high school, right? If you're playing sports and you have a coach, you're playing baseball, your coach sets unrealistic expectations for you. For instance, I was working with a teen recently, and he practices every day after school for 3 hours, rain or shine, which I understand you have to do your craft, but at the same time, if there is any sign of weakness or hurt, it's like, oh, you're a wuss, in that locker room talk, come on, dude, that's wussy stuff, don't act like a girl, and that's really spread within that culture, not only within talking to your peers, but also spreading from the teachers, the coaches, and that societal norm that we kind of push on to young men, young boys, in the meso level of things.
Yeah. And it seems like too, with what you're saying, it does feed into these ideas of hustle culture, and in turn, feeding the capitalistic system we live in. If we have more of these ideas of masculinity, okay, we can't stop working, we can't stop doing this, it really just feeds into the society we're living in.
Definitely.
Okay. What have you noticed from your experience and work is the impact of toxic masculinity?
The impact of me directly or in the work I do?
Both.
Okay. Sure. So in the work I do, again, using an example of a client I had recently, no previous mental health history, 14 boy, had his first significant breakup and started expressing suicidal ideation. I never had these feelings before. The girlfriend also had her own struggles in mental health. And when he got into this crisis, he presented it at the emergency room. They were able to stabilize him. So then he came to me to work and do some interim therapy around this. And it was really difficult at first because his friends, who we played baseball with, the locker room chatter, they're like, I don't get why, she's crazy, dude. And again, it feeds into that toxic masculinity trait of she's crazy, whatever, get over it, no big deal. Don't be a wuss, or don't, why you gotta be sad? That's not cool. Why you acting like a girl? You don't need to cry, all that stuff. And in turn, I feel like a lot of young boys and men have experienced the same exact thing. I know for myself, at an early age, I would say about 8 years old, I started to see the effects of what toxic masculinity is. And I think it becomes that due to getting into sports or choosing what avenue of your interest are. I think when you're a younger kid, under the around first grade or whatever, you're not really thinking of that stuff. You still hear the terms oh, that's even my 6-year-old son, he's oh, we were choosing a recreational magazine came out for his school district, and we were choosing which things he wanted to do this summer as far as activities, and dance was one of them, and volleyball, and he's yeah, that's girls only do that stuff. And he's 6. And so I think it's not as prevalent at that age because he also likes to sing and dance and doesn't care about colors as much. My son also has really long hair. like I do. We haven't cut it for like almost 2 years. And he has been teased about his hair. Like we put it up in a ponytail once when he was playing soccer. And this young girl teased him like, oh, you look like a girl. Why are you doing that? And so in turn, I had to show him pictures of like professional soccer players and basketball players and all these like professionals that have long hair. But again, it's that in our society, it's ingrained. This is what a man is supposed to look like. This is what we're supposed to do. And again, dominance. So we have to be the most dominant person, not only when it comes to oppressing women, but also oppressing like each other as men. So turn back to me, I experienced this the same time at 8 when I was learning like who I was and sports. And I had some trauma happen to me when I was 8, which fed into me binge eating a lot. And I didn't really understand that as a kid. And it can be very common when a traumatic incident happens with a kid where they either overeat, undereat, etc. So I began overeating quite a bit and binge eating to where I gained a lot of weight. And at that point, as I got older, I started getting picked on by boys, getting excluded to things like I don't remember a lot of things from my like young childhood years. Maybe it's trauma, who knows? But I do remember some of the bad things where it's like a kid was like, "Oh, we don't want to play with fat kids," you know. And so from that point on, you know, it became, oh, in order to fit in to this group of people and to the standards of what a boy is supposed to be, I can't be this way. So then that's when I stopped eating and over exercising around the age of 8 and 9. And, you know, I started off going to a therapist then, dealing with my parents' divorce and some other things going on. And, you know, no one wanted to diagnose me with an eating disorder. No one. Like,
interesting.
You know, it's like, oh, he's overeating and he stopped eating lunch. And this was reported to the school counselor by a friend of his that he hadn't eaten and then would overexercise at home. And all these things pointing to an eating disorder. But one, I am Mexican and a person of color, mainly living in a affluent upper middle class white neighborhood growing up. And again, I grew up in Dallas, Texas. And again, looking at a macro level of toxic masculinity, a lot of the providers that I would go see were older white men. So when playing into eating disorders, that's a white female or girl disorder that people commonly see for anorexia, especially looking at like 15 years ago or so, maybe 20, I don't know. I forget how old I am. It's been more than that. And so even though all these signs were pointing toward that, no one wanted to diagnose me with that. And that happened up until my 20s. No one wanted to diagnose me with an eating disorder until it's like, oh, you only ate cereal and skim milk for 6 months. That's not a big deal. Or not eating solids for 6 months. Like, oh, that must be depression and anxiety. No eating disorder. Like, so yeah, I feel like that's definitely affected me throughout growing up on what it means to be man enough, be strong enough, and what we portray as a man who is attractive as well.
Absolutely.
Because as I got older, it turned into like, oh, I want girls to recognize me. I want women to recognize me. And, growing up in the 2000s, I was definitely not like that boy band look. Like I didn't have the whole NSYNC vibe going on at the time. And then I always joke, I don't have the whole Jason Momoa vibe going on at this time either. So, and this is what we portray as, that strong male dominance, right? Which society feeds off of. Sorry, that was a handful of things.
Good. That's good. You touched on a lot of important stuff too, right? Like, not only your personal, I guess, like impact of toxic masculinity, but also how that impacted subtly the providers that were supposed to be treating you effectively and did not, and so, it takes all different shapes. And I think sometimes people think of the more like obvious like types of toxic masculinity, like the dominance, like the violence, but even in those subtle ways and biases that clinicians and social workers hold and continue to use and neglect people that really need treatment.
Definitely.
And then, of course, you had mentioned an important aspect that we might touch on a little bit later, but the cultural dynamic there, right? Like you said, eating disorders are portrayed and viewed as a white woman disorder. And I think even growing up for myself, like that was the first thing I thought of when I thought of an eating disorder. And even in talking to professors and doing case studies and things like this, you never really even saw any people of color, whether it was women of color or particularly men of color, in any kind of depiction of eating disorders. And if there was, I think a lot of the times it was attributed to things like poverty, things like neglect, rather than an actual eating disorder.
Right. And it definitely plays a part into that culturally. One, in general, a lot of people of color don't trust the mental health system or medical system in general. And a lot of people from cultural backgrounds, mental health is not really talked about at all. And then you're also looking at a lot of like Mexican culture, for instance, a lot of community, a lot of love is shown by food. So, but yeah, no, it's interesting because like even to this day, like Brene Brown says, I see a therapist for a therapist, so even like when I'm going to this specific like eating disorder clinic, I'm sitting there and I feel so uncomfortable to this day because I feel like, all these like skinny like white women or white young girls come in and then they see me and they're like, who's this creeper dude hanging out in here? like even when talking to my like therapist, I feel like I have to prove that I have this problem or question myself about it.
Absolutely. We internalize that so much.
Well, yeah, it's for being suppressed, telling people telling me that I didn't have this problem. One, because men don't get that. And two, you don't look like you're a stick. So, we look at popular culture, media, television shows, movies, and eating disorders are typically shown as anorexia, which, that's a big one, but that's not all they are. So, yeah.
And even further with that, anorexia with people that are incredibly thin. It's never anorexia with people that do have some weight on them. It's always you gotta fit the bill to have your bones show.
Right. And even like for instance, Tess Holliday. Are you familiar with her?
Yes.
She has anorexia and she got eaten alive, like from like the media, people commenting on things. It's like, oh, you can't have anorexia, you're like, so overweight, or, like this is because that's set in our mind of what it's supposed to look like. Well, no one shows people what recovery looks like of anorexia, right? So we always just see that very negative image.
Yeah, absolutely. For you, and even in the work that you're doing, how do you see toxic masculinity and eating disorders linked? You've touched on it a little bit, but.
Yeah, so I would say it's linked because this ideal of what it is to be man enough to be portray this ideal of dominance, strength, imposing your will. Like if you have feelings and like culture and like aren't like expressing yourselves in these like manly ways, like then you're obviously like, a wuss or a person who is not that alpha. So as a person who loves sports, all about it, but I also love art and culture, like it's not this one or the other, but growing up very much so, like even to this day, like I have a lot of tattoos, I dress differently or whatever, but it doesn't mean I don't like these what people would call like stereotypical male things that like men should like, right? So I mean, I enjoy like looking at trucks and like car shows and like working with my hands and tools. And I mean, I was a firefighter, and a lot of people were like, you, like even to this day, they're like, you did that? And I'm like, why would you say that?
Yeah.
like because I don't fit the mold. But so yeah, no, I feel like it ties in specifically to eating disorders within men at an early age. Like look at high school, wrestling specifically, you have to be in a certain weight class. A lot of young boys like let's say you're on football, or like you need to have all these muscles, like, right? So you need to be working out in the gym constantly. You're playing basketball, you need to like do some conditioning, and same concept, nose to the grindstone. Swimming, again, weight, fluctuations there. And so from an early age, that's taught to young boys that this is like what you need to look like. And if you're not, then you're an outcast, right? Yeah. You're not one of those popular kids. You're not a jock. Like you can't be mediocre, because if you're mediocre, then you're either a nerd or a weirdo or like an outlier. And from a young age, I felt like I was an outlier and I just wanted to be a part of something. So that played into part me being Mexican, third generation, which was it's a whole nother story, an added layer of being third generation Mexican who doesn't speak Spanish. And wanting to be man enough or boy enough, right, to like feel like I fit in with my friends, that excelled in some sports or were better at these things than I was. And that really started to shape my eating disorder. It's like, well, I really want to feel accepted. And the only way I can do that is by looking at this ideal of what a man is supposed to do. For me, it wasn't necessarily muscular strength, but more like I need to be skinny. And I'm not really sure how that started, but that was always the goal, that I needed to be skinny to fit in, or that would just solve everything.
Right.
Like I'd fit in, I'd be able to be athletic enough, I'd be attractive, people would like me. And I mean, as someone in recovery for an eating disorder, like those thoughts don't really go away. I mean, they're things that you work on, and I think it should be important for people in recovery in any aspect is that as social workers, we don't have a magic wand, right? We're here to help you process these things, but I'm not going to say it's never going to go away. It's how we get through those things and how we deal with them.
And I imagine it's incredibly difficult though, because we're recovering in a society that still very much upholds these beliefs and ideals of what we have to look like. And so, I mean, we're still constantly seeing these images and being like looking at media that's just telling you, no, this is how you need to look. This is how a man needs to act and how to be. And I mean, you're literally trying to recover in the midst of all that.
Yeah, no, and I did get into sports in college. I raced bicycles, so I really love cycling still. But that's another culture that you have to be a certain weight, especially to do road biking or road cycling, and that really played a difficult part in my undergrad years when I was doing that competitively. And yeah, no, again, it's like, oh, because there's even with any niche of things, like there is this dominance, especially among men, even though like cyclists may be thinner, there is still like, oh, I need to have this endurance, like, so be thin, but have all this endurance, and condition my body to be that way. But yeah, no, it's not a coincidence that, we every New Year's we see all the like ads for like gyms and everything.
Yeah.
And at a good point, I was seeing like a personal trainer because I like exercise and it's good to incorporate that. But then a different trainer took over because the one I was seeing left, and I felt uncomfortable. And they didn't really understand my like eating disorder past. And even like a couple of months ago, I haven't gone to this trainer in like a year and a half, maybe longer. They called and left me a message. And one of the things they said that was really odd to me is like, I'm just trying to keep you honest. I'm like,
what?
What? What does that mean? Are you saying I let myself go?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So again, that tactic of like poking at you and how our society just feeds that eating disorder mentality along with like, in order for me to be more of a male, I need to be going to the gym all the time.
That's something I've seen with the clients I work with too, is I work with a fair amount of people that also have eating disorders along with other mental health diagnoses. And they talk about, some of the trainers that they work with, or like they keep working out at the gym. Some of these people they just perpetuate these like hyper focus on calories, on like the number on the scale. I had one client come to me and say that their trainer wanted them to weigh themselves twice a day, every single day. And I'm like, for what reason?
Your weight fluctuates like 5 to 10 pounds a day anyway.
Yeah. And they were talking to me and they were like, yeah, it's not making me feel really good. I'm like, no kidding. Why don't we stop that?
Let's not do that. Yeah, no, and it's always these fad diets are like fad. Every year there's something new. And one I was recently talking about is intermittent fasting.
Yes.
And I'm like, when I first was explained to him, like, that's like a definition of a eating disorder. Like, starving yourself to make yourself lose weight. Like, oh, okay. Like, any form of restriction is restriction. I don't care what, like, even if you're intentionally doing it, then it's restriction. Yeah. Right. So it could be anything, but yeah, it amazes me.
And all that like intermittent fasting, it's just repackaged in fluffy words, but when you actually look at those things for what they are, I mean, they can be incredibly unhealthy and unhelpful for physically and mentally.
Yeah. I mean, to go back to like providers, not just like trainers,
Hmm.
but providers who are even like doctors who are dietitians who aren't trained in mental health or eating disorders.
Yeah.
Like if I find someone who I find has some disordered eating patterns and they're like, I'm like, have you been to a dietitian or a nutrition? They're like, yeah, but then they just said this and like,
Mm.
you know, don't don't eat, junk food, don't eat crappy food, like blah blah blah. And like, some of the, like even doctors bedside manner, if they're not informed, they're like, oh yeah, you just got a little heavy, huh? Like this,
Hmm.
that's not helpful.
No.
um, and so I try to be very cognizant of who I'm sending people to. And I always tell people when they're looking at dietitians, make sure they have like a mental health background, make sure they
Hmm.
understand eating disorders. Like this isn't about fitness, this isn't about losing weight, this is about, you know, um, getting like getting the fuel your body needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are many dietitians and nutritionists and other providers where you can get specific certifications and specializations in eating disorders and making sure that's a part of, your education and your skill set. So
Yeah,
they're out there. Just have to
they
find
are
them.
out there.
Okay. You spoke on the impact of social media and media a little bit, but how else do you see media shaping eating disorders and the prevalence?
Sure. I made the joke of the Jason Momoa comment.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, you see how media portrays what men should look like, or what is desirable.
Hmm.
Um, one of my main inspirations, and if you haven't checked out his podcast, a little shout out to Justin Baldoni, the Man Enough podcast.
Okay.
Super great, life changing stuff. And he has a lot of different people on there, but he talks about how he was casted throughout his career, like, oh, shirtless guy number one,
Mm.
uh, um, like, and he's white, and he's like, oh, I'm going to play Latin person with their shirt on,
Hmm.
and then shirt off later, like, because he's a very like, uh, fit man with
Yeah.
like, chiseled abs and everything. And like if he like didn't keep up with this image, then people wouldn't cast him, so
Mm.
um it's very instilled of like what media portrays on what people want to see,
Mhm.
right? And we see that in superhero films, are like any film that is portraying someone that should be like we're looking up to or inspired to be,
Mhm.
for the most part.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, no, not only specifically with men, but also with women.
Mhm.
And I think people have recognized that with women for a longer period of time
Mhm.
than they have men. And you know men don't really talk about how this could affect them, of like, oh, I need to look like this guy, I'm never going to look like this guy,
Mhm.
and so instead that turns into other types of like toxic traits. So again, asserting my dominance against these other men,
Mhm.
um, to prove that I am manly enough to be attracted, to be attractive, or to
Mhm.
be like, not necessarily proving it to women, but proving it to other men
Mm.
that I am strong enough. I am this dominant figure.
Mhm.
Because let's say, you know, I if I don't show this, then my buddy is going to tease me, right? So
Mhm.
um, I can't talk about my feelings. I obviously am not going to be Jason Momoa. And but I need to assert dominance somehow. So I'm going to be rude. I'm going to be an asshole. I'm going to, talk poorly about women, make misogynistic jokes. I'm going to drink nothing but Busch Light and smoke cigarettes. And, again, proving ourselves to be more manly than others. And that's what you also see that in binge drinking culture in college amongst young men. Oh, bro, I can drink more than you. And that is a status quo thing. And I think it's especially a young amongst white young men. It's definitely a thing that we give, we just kind of take a shy eye, look away from, because oh, they're just doing it in college. That's okay. You can binge drink, talk poorly about women. That's just, I feel like you're in your 20s and your college years. We get a free, a pass,
sure,
no, that's fine. You can do all these messed up things as long as you get over the hump, right? Either you get over the hump or you become a drug addict.
Right.
So, and then you look at that as far as privilege, a lot of these things get a blind eye because these people can come from money, and so we can push that aside, even though you're being a really crappy human being.
Absolutely. You had mentioned, I thought it was interesting, just asserting dominance, not just to women, but to other men. I felt like I saw that play out a lot from a pop culture reference. But with the whole Pete Davidson, Kim K thing happening, I saw so many people saying, I don't understand what women find attractive about Pete Davidson, and because he's skinny and all of this.
Right.
And there's a big conversation about, at least I saw other women from my perspective saying, yeah, we don't really care about the muscles or any of that. You do that for other men.
Yeah, exactly. For me, I always felt like I needed to do more to prove myself to other men. And I think that's how a lot of men feel.
Yeah.
Especially as someone who wasn't naturally built in a athletic body or has great metabolism. That's probably my own fault from an eating disorder, but that's a different conversation. But I always felt when I did the fire department training, it's oh, these people are already judging me by the way I look and having tattoos and being able to express my emotions, my background. They're judging me even harder. So I need to be more man than they are and prove to them that I belong here as a man because this is a male dominated profession and that's what's important.
Yeah. That's very powerful, the impact and how it affects us day to day and just in society. From your perspective, kind of leaning into the social work lens, where do you think social work is lacking in terms of treating eating disorders specifically with men?
Yeah, awareness. I mean,
definitely.
And having there's not a for instance, in Wisconsin, there is only one eating disorder male residential center. The next closest one is in St. Louis that take men. There is not a lot of resources for men to seek eating disorder treatment. So not only is it underdiagnosed because people aren't aware in the field, but it's also not, the services aren't available.
Yeah.
And so if I'm already a man struggling with some toxic masculinity are, thinking going to therapy makes me less than a man. And if there's no resources available and no one cares to do any outreach to these young men or young boys in like a school setting, or if there's awareness, then of course they're not going to seek treatment, and of course they're not going to be diagnosed because there's no resources available. So I think where social work needs to step it up is doing not only some preventative care and education in school settings, especially high schools, middle schools, where not only are we looking at eating disorders, traits with men, but also what it looks like to be a young man, a boy, and to express that we are masculine, that we are man enough, and that masculinity isn't based on just strength. So I think if we can start doing some of that meso work within the school setting, for younger kids to have that outreach, and I mean, then you're crossing the board not only with eating disorders, but gender roles, sexuality, misogyny, preventing like domestic violence. I mean, I think I was reading a statistic that 50% of women have experienced rape or sexual assault before the age of 18. So that has a lot to say about what we're teaching young boys, young men in these settings.
Yeah, absolutely. And more to that too is like providers, once we actually get a person in the room with us, like they're in treatment, to not ignore those signs, to not treat it as something else and just label it as aggression or as like not having empathy or any of these other things, like to actually work to see what social dynamics were at play to create eating disorders and the presence of toxic masculinity.
Yeah, that brings up a good point. I mean, as social workers, we have our implicit bias, and we have to be very aware of that we need to take out that lens that eating disorders only look like young white women who are anorexic, right? So I think a flag that a lot of social workers see is when there's a substance use disorder diagnosis. Generally, it's like, okay, we're going to treat the substance use diagnosis first, but maybe this person is using alcohol or other like stimulants to suppress their eating, and that's the way they get by without eating. So, and not just looking at the substance abuse component, but also the eating disorder component, because there is a lot of comorbidity with eating disorders and substance use that's also not talked about.
Absolutely. In the same vein, what can we do as social workers in terms of reducing toxic masculinity?
Sure.
That's a bigger question.
Again, I think it's just, education. It comes down to psychoeducation within these like meso levels, and having these conversations with, your sons, not only your sons, but your daughters, and making change that way. Another shout out to a person who does a lot of work on talking about masculinity, Jackson Katz. And he talks about the bystander approach. So not only, I feel like as social workers, to help become aware of toxic masculinity with educating, but talking about this bystander approach, which is, if you're being a bystander and you're not saying something when your buddy is making a joke about a woman, then you're equally playing a part in that. And to what it really means to show strength and to have dominance and to be man enough is saying, hey, I'm going to be a leader and I'm not going to say, this is not okay. It's not okay to make these statements. So we can, as social workers, like talk to schools, talk to school social workers, just make it be apparent that like we can target these young boys and young men to say these things aren't not okay. And instead of indicting, we should be inviting, because that's the term where I struggle with toxic masculinity, because men who are a man's man, they're like, oh, like you're saying men suck. So instead of being in, like, I'm automatically indicting you for being a man, but I'm inviting you to this table to show you that, you know, being man enough doesn't just have to do with brute strength.
Redefining it, you know, and to show that it's not this one rigid explanation of what a man has to be or what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, again, with social workers, we need to take the academia out of it. We just need to be real with people.
Yeah.
Drop the terminology all the time that we use and meet people where they're at and say, hey, here's some like make the language to be understandable to that person, rather than throwing some jargon at them.
Absolutely. Because especially when we're talking about things like toxic masculinity and anyone struggling with an eating disorder, the jargon is meaningless. Like, if anything, I think it'll put someone's defenses up, because here we are already vulnerable and have the courage enough to even get into treatment or to start the process. And now all of a sudden I have no idea what's going on because all these words are being thrown at me.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, wonderful. I mean, this has been an amazing podcast. I mean,
thank you.
So much. I really appreciate you being able to come on and offer so much helpful insight. For those listening, where can they continue to follow you on your journey?
Sure. You can use my email. So it's L as in Lucas, and then Contreras, CONTRERAS 2 at wisc.edu, WISC. And then I also have an Instagram, which I post a lot about my family, eating disorder struggles, mental health awareness, domestic violence awareness, and all of that. And my Instagram is Dad Boots.
Okay. Great Instagram handle.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for listening. Feel free to share your thoughts on today's episode on whatever platform you're listening on. Like, share, and follow the Social Work Bubble, and have a good one.